This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Tui, korimako and tauhou or silvereyes are much loved garden birds, and by consuming the nectar of native plants they are important pollinators for rewilding. So what can we do to help them? Does feeding sugar water make a positive difference? Or could bird feeders help spread the bird flu variant H1N1 when it reaches our shores? Grab yourself a treat and put your feet up to listen in to Rewilding in Action. Kia ora, welcome to Rewilding in Action with me, your host, Maureen Howard. On today's episode, I'm in the OAR FM studio with my guest, conservation biologist Dr Daria Erastova, who's on the end of the line and calling in from Christchurch. Daria is currently working for Forest and Bird, but she did her PhD on the impacts of birds' sugar water feeding here in Aotearoa. And this is a topic I think that's very close to people's hearts. About 50% of the population do feed birds. So I'm really keen to talk to Daria about her PhD so that we can get a better understanding of the impacts of this activity on the behavioural ecology of the birds, on their health, on the wider ecosystem, and critical rewilding functions like pollination and seed dispersal. So I'm very keen to talk to you, Daria. So welcome to the programme.
Tēnā katoa, emihiana ki ngā mana whenua, ko Daria Erastova tōku ingoa, no o tautahia hau, kia ora.
Kia ora.
Hello, Maureen. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. So my name is Daria, and I'm a bird nerd, one of the many bird nerds in this country. I have a lifelong interest in birds, in their ecology, and other aspects of their biology. This interest prompted me to join the University of Auckland in 2018. My colleagues and I, we looked at the ecological effects of urban sugar water feeding on native garden birds.
Right. And why did you leave out the bread and seed? Was it because you kind of knew what the findings were for those?
Right. As I mentioned, this research was done with a group of people. One of the people was Josie Galbraith, who now works with the War Memorial Museum in Auckland. Josie was my predecessor. So in her PhD, she looked at the ecological effects of seed and bread feeding on New Zealand birds. You see, in some countries, such as Western Europe, bread and seed feeding for birds is extremely popular. It seems that New Zealanders inherited the practice of bird and seed feeding in their daily routine. And so Josie looked at how it affected native birds. Short answer is negatively. Bread and seed feeders only attracted introduced birds, mostly birds introduced from Europe, from the UK, such as starlings, blackbirds, sparrows. So native New Zealand wildlife did not benefit from such feeders. In addition, Josie sampled some of the birds, sparrows in particular, and sampled the feeders, the constructions itself, for the presence of salmonella, which, as I'm sure you know, is a nasty pathogen that can cause bird mortality and also can be transferred onto humans. So Josie showed that 7% of the birds that she sampled were positive for salmonella, and some of the seed feeders were positive for salmonella. So this is the associated risks with bread and seed feeding. So Josie's conclusion was that bread and seed feeding is not helpful for native wildlife, and she suggested that the alternative to support native garden birds would be the use of sugar water feeders, because some garden birds in New Zealand consume nectar, which is kind of close to sugar water. So my job, when I started my PhD, my job was to establish whether sugar water feeding is actually okay for native birds.
Yeah, that's great. So people will know them, the tui, bellbirds. We've got them down here, silvereye or tauhou. And so I guess these would be our three main species down here in Dunedin. So just to give us a little bit of Ecology 101, what do you see as the main purpose of the nectar?
The main evolutionary purpose of nectar is to attract pollinators so that plants can sexually reproduce. And so nectar, being sweet food source, which is high in energy, attracts a group of animals which we call pollinators. In some countries, those are primarily insects, but in New Zealand, we have insects who act as pollinators, for example, native bees and introduced bees, and also nectarivorous birds. Nectarivorous means an animal that consumes nectar, feeds on nectar.
So it really sets the bird, in terms of when people are thinking about feeding the sugar water to birds, they might be imagining, they're assisting the bird. And also it's a really great way to get to be close to birds, which is really wonderful. But those nectarivorous birds, they're actually performing a function in the environment, helping to pollinate plants, which we'll get onto a bit later. And so I was really interested in looking at some of the unintended consequences of feeding birds sugar water and to get that on balance, whether it's a good idea or not such a good idea. And when we think about, the behavioural ecology of birds, how far they're foraging, does it impact that? Perhaps males are more likely to be feeding more than females. And so there's a whole lot of issues to look at, I think, when we're looking at what it is to feeding birds. And so when you first came in, what were some of the questions that you were most interested in?
Sure, there were three main blocks of questions in the first part of the study. We wanted to explore the existing practices of sugar water feeding in New Zealand. We wanted to understand how people feed birds, what were their motivations. Another very important question was to figure out whether sugar water feeders actually attract our target species, korimako, tauhou, tui, that you mentioned. We also wanted to see whether individual choices made by feeding households affected the bird composition at sugar water feeders. So this is the first big block. The second big block, we wanted to explore bird behavior at the feeders, in particular aggressive behavior and foraging behavior, whether there was any relation to season or climate or sugar concentration or type of feeder that was used. And in the third and final block, we looked at birds' welfare, birds associated with sugar water feeders. We wanted to explore what conditions the birds were at, whether they had any parasites, whether feeders had any pathogens on them. Yeah.
So it was really quite comprehensive. It was quite across the country, wasn't it?
Yes, correct. So for the first part, that included collecting information on the existing sugar water feeding practices, we conducted an online nationwide survey and we asked a lot of questions. How much sugar do you use? What feeders do you use? What birds you see come in? How often do you clean your feeder, etc., etc.? And for the subsequent two stages of the study, we actually recruit volunteering households. They had to feed certain criteria. And so I did observational studies and sample birds for pathogens in those gardens.
Right. And so you do catch the birds and ban them as well, I guess, to be able to do that, did you?
Of course, some observations were made with unbanded birds. It's relatively easy to catch tauhou. They're very sweet, cooperative birds. We've banded quite a few. I've banded some 300 tauhou, silvereye. But tui and korimako, they are very smart and feisty, and it's very difficult to catch them. So I aimed to band as many birds as possible. First, that they have a number on a band, so they receive their bird passport. But my other aim was to put a combination of color bands on their legs so I can tell the individuals apart, so I can track the behavior of individuals. Unfortunately, there were not enough cooperative tauhou and korimako to band enough individuals. But some were banded, and most importantly, the birds that I managed to catch were sampled for the presence of pathogens.
Right. And how did that come out then? Because obviously it is something to consider if birds are feeding and congregating and being close to each other, perhaps feeding from the same source and everything about, in terms of what kind of diseases are getting spread. So was it just salmonella that you looked at?
A number of things. So I swabbed both sugar water feeders and birds for the presence of salmonella. Thanks goodness, all the probes returned negative. I also tested birds for the presence of chlamydia. Once again, all tests were negative. We tested for the presence of feather lice, coccidia, this is a gastrointestinal infection, and clinical signs of avian flu.
And we should say that you were comparing gardens where there were feeders and then gardens where there weren't feeders, isn't that right? And I just have a question about that, because if my next door neighbour, let's say, had a feeder and my other neighbour on the other side had a feeder but I didn't, then could that influence the behaviour of the birds? Because presumably, they might move around a little bit in their habitat. So did you look at that, in terms of what neighbours were doing, or did you look at each garden as an individual entity?
So urban studies are challenging because of the composition of urban landscape. It's virtually impossible to get access to all the household in the area to compare how birds behaved in the garden next door to the feeder. So we had a number of participating gardens with feeders, and we compared bird behavior in between those gardens with the feeders. So we compared different sugar concentrations, seasons, climates. So naturally, birds would be interested in sugar water because it's a easily accessible, low quality, but high in calories food source. To complicate the matter, birds are territorial. So depending on the location of the feeder and the surrounding settings, a feeder can be dominated by a pair of aggressive tauhou or korimako that would exclude other birds from coming in that source. However, if so happened that there is no breeding pair in the area, more birds can have access to sugar water feeder. We looked at how birds behaved at feeders in different seasons and in different climates. When I say different climates, I mean we conducted the study in Auckland and Dunedin. The two cities were chosen as climatic extremes of New Zealand. And indeed, we found statistical difference in bird behavior. So first of all, we figure out that birds use feeders more often in winter than in summer, which makes sense to us because in urban environment, not much natural food could be available for birds, unlike natural environment when birds cope to find things to eat year round. But in urban environment with, not enough vegetation, lower invertebrate diversity, that could be challenging. So birds get more desperate, and that prompts them to visit sugar water feeders. We also found that birds acted more aggressively in winter, once again. We think because the competition increased for this cheap, low in quality, but cheap, easily accessible food source. We found that birds preferred sweeter water. So the higher the concentration was, the more interested were birds in visiting those sugar water feeders, and the more aggressive they were. Once again, it was a war for calories. I need to sustain myself in winter, so get lost. I'm going to dominate this feeder, especially tauhou acted very aggressively around those feeders. Birds visited feeders more often in Auckland, which is an interesting conclusion. This is something that I did not expect. I expect them to be more desperate in the harsher Dunedin climate. But no, actually, there were more visits in Auckland. Perhaps this is a bit speculative, but perhaps the fact that Auckland is more urbanized than Dunedin means lesser food sources for birds in winter.
That made me think of that too, because Dunedin is a very green city. And I was looking at an article that Jolanda van Heesik and Phil Seddon had done out at Orokonui. There might have been a few other authors in there too. But they were looking at the kaka to see how much they were using the feeders in terms of just looking at the sugar water. And they found that it was only a maximum of up to around 2.75% of their calories actually came from the sugar water, which is very low. But then obviously in Orokonui, there's a huge, wonderful dinner plate of varieties of natural plants to consume. So that's quite interesting to know. And what were your overall conclusions that you came to? Did you come to the conclusion that feeding birds sugar water was a really good idea? Or did you come away feeling that maybe not so much?
Before I reply to this question, I actually need to elaborate a little bit more on the pathogen study that we did. So we found a bit of a controversy with bird health around sugar water feeders. So first of all, we found that there was a correlation between the presence of sugar water feeder and coccidia infection. So we think that a coccidia infection or gastrointestinal parasite can be transmitted from bird to bird via sugar water feeders. We also found that birds were in a poorer body condition at in the gardens with sugar water feeders compared to gardens where we did not install a sugar water feeder. Actually, it's a hen and egg situation because it's really hard to tell what comes first. It's possible that the birds who were in poor condition were not competitive to get natural high quality food sources, so that prompted them to turn to feeders. Or it could be a completely opposite situation where a bird was bounded to this territory because it chose to nest there, for example, and the only valuable source was that sugar water feeder. And as a result of a prolonged consumption of sugar water, the body condition deteriorated. So it's a bit speculative. However, we found that with high sugar concentration, the body condition was a little bit better. So one of the conclusions that I made was that if you absolutely must provide birds with sugar water, make sure it's really sweet. Be generous. Don't go halfway.
So about a cup in every litre, would you say? A cup of sugar in every litre.
A cup of sugar in every liter. However, as I said, there were associated risks, such as coccidia infection, increased aggression, and poor body condition. So the conclusion that I made was that sugar water feeding does not impose big negative effects compared to bread and seed feeding. So overall, it was not bad to provide native birds with sugar water, as long as people are aware of the associated risks and take measures to keep the high standard of hygiene, keep their feeders predator-proof, clean, and choose smart feeders. Let me explain what smart feeders are. Basically, we can divide all the variety of feeders into two major groups. Let's call the first group non-specific and the second group specific. So non-specific feeder, that could be anything, a bowl, an ice cream container, anything that is available at your household. We call it non-specific because such feeders would attract not only native garden birds, but also introduced birds, such as sparrows and myna and starlings. Those birds will take any food source that they encounter, including sugar water. So we already know that species like sparrows can carry and transfer salmonella. So imagine what happens when introduced species feed with native birds. There is a risk of transmission of pathogens such as salmonella. Plus, non-specific feeders, well, basically it's an open bowl, okay? So anything can go inside, including feces with salmonella, feces with coccidia, all the dirt, all the pathogen can go in there. So it's really hard to maintain high standard of hygiene using such feeders. So it can be potentially harmful for native birds. On the other hand, we have commercially valuable feeders specifically designed for native birds. So native birds have the morphology and the behavior to forage using those specific feeder types that contain sugar water feeder closed and protected from contamination, thus reducing the risk of pathogen transmission and excluding unwanted species, such as sparrows. I agree sparrows are cute, but we have too many of them. They don't need our protection at this stage. We understand that some people will continue using sugar water feeders no matter what we say, because it's an easy and affordable way to connect with birds. I just wanted to give a heads up to bird lovers that just like junk food can save you from death if you starve, it's not the best idea to eat only junk food for the rest of your life. That will make you sick. The same with birds. Sugar water is a desperate attempt to attract and support birds. Unfortunately, sugar water is just sugar and water. It doesn't contain all the goods, all the nutrients, vitamins, minerals, proteins that natural food sources have. And that's not just nectar. It also invertebrates, the source of protein for birds. Birds don't live on nectar only. They need a diversity of food. So sugar water feeder is not harmful for birds, but it's not the key to support and sustain their populations. There are other ways people can help birds, such as plant native trees, introduce safe water baths, protect birds from colliding in windows by placing images on the windows, and in my opinion, most importantly, carrying on backyard predator control. Predator control is the main reason of bird mortality in urban New Zealand environment.
So I love your ideas that you've suggested here, that ways in which people can help protect birds and do the right thing by our bird population. In terms of connecting with birds, I think a lot of people are doing it to connect. What kind of suggestions would you have for other ways in which people connect with birds? For example, what ways do you connect?
Oh, there are so many ways. I'm a bird watcher and a twitcher myself. I take my pair of binoculars whenever I go, and I observe birds and I record what birds and how many birds I saw, and then I submit the numbers to eBird. That's a user-friendly app, which is easy to use. And many scientists in New Zealand and outside of the country use data from eBird. So by entering what you saw in your backyard, you can become a citizen scientist, and you can help scientists all over the world to know more about birds. You can plant for birds. You can create a bird-friendly garden, which is pleasant to the eye, but also attracts lots of insects, spiders that bird can take, and bird will stay in your garden. They may choose to nest in your garden because it's so nice. It has a bird bath. It has safe environment. You keep your cat indoor like I do. My cat is an indoor cat, or maybe your cat has a bell on it. You have lots of perches for birds to sit and sing, and then you can enjoy them almost 24/7 because they won't leave your garden. They would want to stay.
Thanks so much to Dr. Daria Erastova for coming on this episode. It's not too often that someone's PhD is so relevant to so many New Zealanders, and I hope your little treat helped you cope with hearing that the benefits of feeding sugar water seem marginal at best and more likely not good for birds. I'm wondering, with the bird flu H1N1 variant being imminent and inevitable, will the government support the Department of Conservation to go on an education drive to discourage people from artificial feeding and to encourage us to plant instead? The good news is that we have other satisfying ways to connect with birds. A reasonable pair of binoculars will open up the lives of birds, even from the comfort of your armchair. And I just want to add a little word about honey and water, which I know that some people use instead of sugar, hoping that it's healthier for birds. However, Daria explained to me after this recording that with honey, there are several additional health risks to birds and that actually sugar water is closer in its composition to nectar. And of course, the best thing of all is to get into the garden, do some planting or rewilding. And some great nectar-producing plants include harakeke, cabbage tree, ko tukutuku or tree fuchsia, ko tauhou or Pittosporum tenuifolium, ko-fi, and tarata or lemonwood. So thank you for listening to Rewilding in Action. I'm Maureen Howard, and it would be awesome if you can share this podcast, especially with your bird-loving friends who have feeders. In a fortnight's time, I will be interviewing a panel about the Miyawaki method of microforest creation, the DCC's plan to create one, and how it compares with rewilding a forest through natural native forest regeneration. So until next time, I will leave you with the sounds of tauhou or silvereye, recorded by my guest Dr Daria Erastova, a rewilder who is letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.